Part 1, Shattered Promises. The storm outside mirrored the one brewing inside our home. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a forewarning of the destruction about to unfold between us. Julian stood before me, his face contorted in rage, his hands clenched into fists so tight that his knuckles turned white. "Emma," he seethed, his voice barely controlled. "I don't want to see you again." His words sliced through me, sharper than any blade. I had imagined this moment countless times in my mind, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer weight of it. He wanted me gone. For a brief second, I thought about pleading, about reminding him of the years we had built together, of the sacrifices we had made to stand where we were now. But I had too much pride. Too much self-respect. I reached into my bag, my fingers trembling as they grasped the worn divorce agreement. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if infused with the burden of all the love and pain it carried. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced my voice to be steady. "In that case, let's get divorced." Silence. Deafening silence. Julian's body stiffened, his expression unreadable. For the first time, his anger wavered, replaced by something else, something dangerously close to disbelief. "What did you just say?" His voice was lower now, rough, like gravel scraping against pavement. I forced myself to meet his gaze, even though the intensity in his eyes made my chest tighten. I held the document out to him, the only proof of my resolve. "I don't love you anymore. Let's end this peacefully. After everything we've been through, I don't think that's too much to ask." His stare burned into me as though he was searching for a trace of hesitation, a flicker of doubt. There was none. Or at least, I had buried it deep enough that even he couldn't find it. The next moment, his anger erupted. With a sharp motion, he swatted the papers out of my hands, sending them flying to the floor. The sound echoed in the room, but I stood my ground, refusing to let the shock register on my face. My body, however, betrayed me. A wave of dizziness washed over me, my knees nearly buckling under the weight of it all. Julian's voice was harsh, like ice breaking. "You want a divorce? Fine. But once you step out that door, Emma, don't ever think about coming back." I forced a smile onto my lips, though my insides twisted painfully. "I hope you don't regret saying that." His expression darkened, the veins in his neck taut with restraint. We had been together long enough to know exactly where to wound each other the deepest, and tonight, we weren't holding back. I turned away before my emotions could betray me, marching upstairs with every ounce of strength I had left. My vision blurred as I hastily stuffed clothes into a suitcase, my fingers numb with cold. This wasn't how things were supposed to end. I should be relieved, I told myself. This is what he wants. This is what you want. But as I reached for the doorknob, my eyes landed on the wedding photo hanging on the wall. Julian's smile in that picture was so genuine, so full of life and love. The man standing downstairs, the man who had just told me to leave, was that even the same person? I lingered for a moment too long, lost in the past, until the honk of a car outside SN apped me back to reality. Time to go. With one last look at the home we had built together, I closed the door behind me. Julian stood at the foot of the stairs as I descended, his arms crossed, his jaw set. He made no move to help with my luggage. Once upon a time, he would have rushed forward, taking everything from my hands, scolding me for even thinking about lifting anything heavy. How could my precious wife carry these things? He would have teased, pressing a kiss to my forehead. That version of him no longer existed. The air between us was suffocating, thick with unsaid words and unbearable tension. He didn't speak. I didn't look at him. I stepped outside, into the cold drizzle that had started without me noticing. The wind cut through me, sending shivers down my spine, but it wasn't the weather that made my breath hitch. Julian's voice stopped me in my tracks. I waited, my heart pounding against my ribs. This was it. This was the moment he would stop me, tell me he didn't mean it, that he still wanted me, that we could fix this. But he didn't. He hesitated, and then the silence stretched on for so long that my hopes shattered. I picked up my suitcase, squared my shoulders, and walked away. As I closed the door behind me, I heard the unmistakable crash of something breaking inside the house. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing did. The rain had picked up by the time I reached the old apartment, our first home. I hadn't set foot here in years, but with nowhere else to go, it felt like the only place that made sense. Nostalgia wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. I found the key at the bottom of my bag and inserted it into the lock, but no matter how hard I twisted, the door wouldn't open. A voice startled me. "Emma? What are you doing here this late? Didn't you sell this place?" I turned to see my old neighbor watching. Me with concern. A flood of memories hit me. I had mortgaged this apartment years ago, back when Julian and I were struggling to build our empire from the ground up. I had nowhere to go. I was homeless. The neighbor must have seen the panic in my eyes because she stepped forward, her voice softer now. "Where's Julian? I can call him." "No," I blurted out too quickly. "He's busy." She gave me a look that told me she wasn't convinced. "You always say that. No matter how busy a man is, he should take care of his wife. What's a home without a wife?" I forced a smile, unable to argue. The wind howled through the corridor, chilling me to the bone, but I barely felt it. I was already numb. "I just came to check on something," I lied. "I should go." The neighbor insisted on walking me downstairs. I let her, too exhausted to protest. When we reached the entran, I assured her a taxi was already on its way. She hesitated before finally turning back, disappearing into the building. And then, alone once more, I stood there, staring at the empty road ahead, realizing that for the first time in years, I had nowhere to belong. My phone rang, shattering the silence. "Julian." My breath hitched as I answered. "Hello?" His voice was sharp, laced with irritation. "What are you doing? Why did you go back there?" I closed my eyes, pressing my lips together. It won. Happen again. He scoffed. "Since you wanted a divorce, could you stop making me worry about your stupid affairs?" Something inside me cracked. I bit my lip to keep my voice from trembling. "Okay." There was a long pause, as if he hadn't expected me to surrender so easily. Then, without another word, he hung up. The rain fell harder, soaking through my clothes, but I didn't move. The loneliness pressed down on me like a crushing weight. Everything was over. Or so I thought. Part 2, The Weight of Goodbye. The rain poured relentlessly as I stood on the sidewalk, the cold seeping through my clothes and into my bones. I had nowhere to go. The realization hit me harder than I had expected. I had spent so many years beside Julian, building a life that revolved around him, around us. And now, standing alone, I felt the crushing weight of that dependence. The phone in my hand still buzzed with the remnants of Julian's irritation, his words echoing in my mind. "Could you stop making me worry about your stupid affairs?" It was almost laughable. He didn't care, he just didn't want me to be an inconvenience. My grip on the handle of my suitcase tightened. I had to move. standing here, frozen in my own despair, would change nothing. With heavy steps, I walked toward the only place I could think of, the small motel on the outskirts of the city, where no one knew me, where no one would ask questions. The receptionist barely looked up as she handed me the key. The room was small, dimly lit, but at least it was dry. The moment I closed the door behind me, my body sagged. The exhaustion was overwhelming. I dropped my suitcase by the bed and let myself slide down to the floor, my arms wrapping around my knees. This was my reality now. Tears welled in my eyes, but I blinked them away. There was no point in crying. This was my choice. I had walked away, and I would live with it. Days passed in a blur. I avoided my reflection in the mirror, avoided my thoughts. The world outside continued without me. Every morning, I forced myself out of bed, sat by the window, and watched the rain turn to sunshine, then back to rain again. I ignored my phone. I didn't want to see Julian's name, didn't want to hear his voice dripping with cold indifference. The pain in my chest grew heavier with each passing moment, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. Then one evening, my phone rang again. I stared at the screen. Julian. My fingers hovered over the answer button. I had sworn not to pick up, to let him live his life while I tried to salvage what was left of mine. But something inside me ached to hear his voice, even if it was just to remind me that he was still real. That we were still real. Taking a shaky breath, I answered. Hello? Emma. His voice was tight, controlled. We need to finalize the divorce. Let's meet at the Civil Affairs Bureau next Monday. The words hung between us, suffocating, final. I gripped the phone tighter, trying to force the lump in my throat back down. Okay. Silence. Then, without another word, he hung up. I sat there, staring at the blank screen, feeling the last shred of hope inside me crumble. This was it. No turning back. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and false hope. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly as the doctor flipped through my test results, his brow furrowed in concern. Your condition is worsening, he said, his voice careful. I strongly advise you to consider the surgery. It won't cure you completely, but it could extend your life. I stared at the medical report in my hands, the words blurring together. Brain tumor. Surgery. Uncertain outcome. The weight of it all settled on my chest, suffocating me. All thin. "'Kay about it," I murmured, knowing full well I wouldn't. The doctor sighed. Emma, this isn't something you can put off forever. I forced a smile. I understand. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push further. As I walked out of the hospital, my legs felt heavy, my steps uncertain. I didn't have the luxury of time. Every moment I wasted was another moment closer to the inevitable. And yet, I found myself wishing, hoping, that Julian would somehow see past my silence, past my stubbornness, and realize the truth before it was too late. But I knew better. Julian was already moving on. The cafe was quiet, filled with the soft hum of conversations and the occasional clinking of coffee cups. I sat in the corner, staring out the window, watching the people outside rush through their lives without a second thought. Emma? I turned at the sound of my name and found myself looking up at a familiar face. Henry. His expression was unreadable as he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. I heard you were in town. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure what to say. Henry had been Julian's closest friend in college, the one who had always been there, quietly watching from the sidelines. There had been a time when I thought he had feelings for me, but he never acted on them. Ow, as he looked at me, his gaze filled with something close to concern, I wondered if he had ever really stopped caring. "You don't look well," he said finally, his voice softer now. "What's going on?" I forced a smile, brushing my fingers against the rim of my coffee cup. "Nothing. Just life." Henry studied me for a long moment, then leaned forward. "Emma, does Julian know?" The question made my stomach tighten. I knew what he was asking. "There's nothing to know," I lied, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Julian and I are done. That's all." His expression darkened. "That's not what I meant." I stiffened. He knew. Somehow, he knew. "Emma," he said quietly, "if you don't tell him, I will." I looked away, my fingers clenching around my cup. "Please don't." "Why?" His voice was sharp now, edged with frustration. "He has the right to know." I shook my head. "It's better this way. Julian has already moved on. He doesn't need to be burdened with this." Henry exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand down his face. "You're unbelievable, you know that?" he muttered. "You think you're protecting him, but you're just running away." I swallowed hard, staring at the table. Maybe he was right. But it didn't matter. I had made my choice. And now, I had to live with it. That night, as I lay in my motel bed, staring at the ceiling, I found myself thinking about Julian again. The way he used to hold me. The way he used to smile at me like I was his entire world. I closed my eyes, willing the memories away, but they clung to me, relentless. Somewhere in the distance, my phone buzzed. I didn't check it. I already knew who it was. And I knew that no matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't go back. Not now. Not ever. Part 3, A Heart Divided. The morning of the divorce appointment arrived with an eerie stillness. The city outside my motel window was just beginning to stir, but inside, everything felt frozen. My suitcase sat in the corner, still packed from the night I left Julian's house, a silent reminder that I had nowhere permanent to go. I stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror, pressing my fingers against my pale cheeks. I had done my best to cover the dark circles beneath my eyes, to make myself look presentable. Not for Julian, but for my own dignity. If this was going to be our final moment, I didn't want him to see me looking broken. As I slipped on my coat and grabbed my bag, my phone vibrated. A message. My heart pounded in my chest before I even glanced at the screen. "Julian. Julian, are you coming?" It was a simple question, but the weight behind it felt crushing. I exhaled shakily before typing a response. "Me, on my way." No more hesitation. No more second guessing. This was the end, and I had to face it. The Civil Affairs Bureau was a gray, lifeless building, its walls cold and uninviting. I walked through the entrance, my footsteps echoing in the hollow corridor. There was nothing romantic about divorcing someone you once thought you'd grow old with. No ceremony, no vows, no witnesses filled with joy. Just paperwork and a stamp that would legally erase us from each other's lives. Julian was already waiting for me inside. He sat on a bench, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers loosely laced together. He looked up as I approached, and for a split second, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Something familiar. Something I wished I didn't recognize. "Emma," he said, standing up, his voice unreadable. "You're here." I nodded, clutching my bag tighter. "Let's get this over with." We walked to the counter in silence, side by side yet miles apart. The woman behind the desk barely looked at us as she slid the divorce agreement across the surface. "Sign here," she said, handing us both pens. "Once this is finalized, you'll both be legally single." My hands trembled as I took the pen, my pulse roaring in my ears. I glanced at Julian. His expression was blank, his fingers wrapped tightly around the pen, unmoving. He wasn't signing. A lump formed in my throat. "Julian?" His jaw tensed. He looked at me, his eyes dark, unreadable. Then, he scoffed under his breath and tossed the pen onto the desk. "I can't do this." My breath hitched. "What?" Julian turned to me fully now, his eyes blazing. "You want this? Fine. But I need you to tell me to my face that you don't love me anymore." I froze. My lips parted, but no words came out. "Say it," he pressed, stepping closer. "Look me in the eyes and say you don't love me." I swallowed, forcing myself to meet his gaze. My fingers curled into fists at my sides. "Julian." He cut me off. "You can't, can you?" His voice was quiet, almost vulnerable. "Because you do." I felt my heart constrict, but I shook my head. "It doesn't matter anymore." Julian let out a bitter laugh. "It matters. It always mattered." "Julian, please," I whispered. "Don't make this harder than it already is." His expression hardened, and just like that, the warmth I had glimpsed disappeared. Without another word, he snatched the pen back, scrawled his signature across the page, and stepped away. "Fine," he said coldly. "We're done." I swallowed back the tightness in my throat and forced my fingers to move, signing my own name beneath his. The woman at the desk took the documents without ceremony and stamped them. A finality that hit like a bullet to the chest. "That's it," she said, pushing our copies back toward us. "You're divorced." Julian grabbed his copy and shoved it into his coat pocket without looking at me. Then, without another glance, he turned and walked out of the building. I stayed behind, gripping the document in my shaking hands, staring at my name on the page as if seeing it for the first time. Emma Carter. No longer Emma Carter-Leong. No longer Julian's wife. No longer part of his life. I had fought for this moment. I had convinced myself this was what I wanted. So why did it feel like the world had just collapsed around me? I wandered the streets without direction, lost in my own haze of regret. The sounds of the city faded into a distant hum, my men. Trapped in an endless loop of memories. The way Julian used to trace patterns on my back when he thought I was asleep. The way he'd pull me into his arms in the middle of the night, whispering things he'd never say in the daylight. The way he kissed my forehead before leaving for work, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Stop thinking about him. But I couldn't. I was still in love with a man who no longer belonged to me. My feet carried me to the last place I should have gone. The hospital. Henry was waiting for me outside my doctor's office, his expression tight. "Emma," he said, exhaling heavily. "You need to stop doing this to yourself." I shrugged off his concern. "I'm fine." He scoffed. "You're not fine. You just finalized a divorce with a man you're still in love with, and you're ignoring your health like it doesn't matter." I crossed my arms, looking away. "It doesn't." "Emma," Henry's voice softened, but there was a plea hidden in his tone. "You can't just give up." I looked at him then, really looked at him. The worry in his eyes, the quiet desperation. He cared. He had always cared. But he wasn't Julian. I need to be alone, I whispered, stepping back. Please. Henry's jaw tensed, but after a long pause, he nodded. Fine. But don't expect me to stop looking out for you. I turned and walked away before he could say anything else, before he could convince me to stay. I had already lost everything that mattered. What was there left to fight for? Part 4, The Truth Left Unspoken. The days blurred into nights, and time lost its meaning. I drifted between moments, existing but never truly living. The weight of the divorce sat heavy on my chest, but I told myself it was for the best. I told myself Julian was moving on, just as I should be. But the reality was, I was running out of time. The dizziness had become more frequent, my body betraying me with every passing day. The tumor in my brain was relentless, a shadow growing stronger, consuming more of me with each breath. The doctor's words echoed in my mind. You don't know when you might fall asleep and never wake up again. I had refused the surgery. I had told myself it didn't matter. But now, standing on the edge of my mortality, I wondered if I had made a mistake. Would Julian care if he knew? Would it change anything? I hadn't seen Julian since the divorce. I told myself that was a good thing. But when I found myself standing in front of his office building one evening, I knew I was lying to myself. I wasn't here for closure. I was here because I needed to see him, just once more. Through the glass doors, I could see him. He was standing in the lobby, dressed in his usual sharp suit, his expression unreadable. He looked the same. Like the divorce hadn't touched him at all. But then I saw something that made my stomach twist. Sophia. She stood beside him, laughing softly as she placed a hand on his arm. The sight of it made my breath catch. It shouldn't have hurt. I had no right to feel this way. I had walked away. I had given him the freedom to be with whoever he wanted. But that didn't stop the ache in my chest. Before I could turn away, Julian's gaze lifted and locked onto mine. For a moment, the world fell away. It was just us, just the ghosts of what we used to be. I saw something flicker in his eyes, recon. Ishin, surprise, something deeper, something raw. Then his expression hardened, and just like that, the moment was gone. I took a step back, willing myself to leave before I shattered entirely. But Julian moved first. He pulled away from Sophia and strode toward me, his eyes dark, intense. Before I could react, he was standing in front of me, the scent of him so painfully familiar it nearly broke me. Emma. His voice was tight. What are you doing here? I forced a smile even as my heart pounded dead in my chest. I was just passing by. Didn't expect to see you here. His gaze flickered over me, taking in the exhaustion in my face, the way my body seemed weaker than before. Are you okay? I laughed, the sound hollow. I'm fine, Julian. You don't have to worry about me anymore. His jaw tensed. I never said I. Julian, Sophia's voice interrupted, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached. We should go. I looked between them, the image of them together burning itself into my mind. I needed to leave. I needed to get away before I said something I'd regret. Goodbye, Julian, I whispered, stepping back. But before I could turn, his fingers wrapped around my wrist. Not tight, not forceful, but enough to make me stop. Emma, he said, his voice lower now, almost hesitant. Are you really okay? I looked up at him, and for a split second, I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to tell him about the tumor, about the surgery I refused, about the nights I lay awake wondering if I'd wake up the next morning. But then I saw Sophia watching us, her lips pressed together, waiting. And I realized the truth didn't matter anymore. "I'm fine," I lied, pulling away from his grasp. "Take care, Julian." And then I walked away, leaving behind the only man I had ever loved. That night, the pain came worse than before. It started as a dull ache in my skull, something I had learned to live with. But then it became sharper, a stabbing sensation that made my vision blur. I collapsed onto the floor of my motel room, my breaths coming in short gasps. I tried to reach for my phone, but my fingers felt numb. My vision darkened, the edges of my world collapsing in on me. The last thing I remembered was the sound of someone banging on my door before everything went black. I woke up in a hospital bed, the beeping of machines filling the silence around me. Henry was sitting beside me, his eyes dark with worry. "Emma," he said, his voice hoarse. "What the hell were you thinking?" I swallowed, my throat dry. "How did you? You didn't answer your phone." "I came to check on you," he said, rubbing a hand over his face. "And I found you unconscious. Do you have any idea how scared I was?" I closed my eyes, exhaustion pressing down on me. "Henry, Don't," he snapped. "Don't say you're fine." "You're not fine, Emma." I sighed, knowing he was right. I didn't want anyone to worry. Henry let out a bitter laugh. "And look where that got you." Silence settled between us. Then he exhaled, shaking his head. "Emma, you need to tell Julian." My eyes snapped open. "No. He deserves to know," Henry argued. "You think you're protecting him by keeping this from him, but you're not. You're just hurting yourself." I shook my head. "It's too late. He's moved on." Henry's expression darkened. "Is that what you think? That just because he's standing next to another woman, he stopped loving you?" My heart clenched. "He signed the divorce papers. He walked away." Henry leaned forward. "And so did you. But if he knew the truth, do you really think he'd let you go this easily?" I looked away, my hands trembling in my lap. "I don't want him to love me out of pity." Henry sighed. "It's not pity, Emma. It's love. And whether you admit it or not, you still love him too." Tears burned at the back of my eyes. "It doesn't matter. I don't have much time left, Henry. What good would it do to bring him back into my life just to make him watch me die?" Henry stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Fine. If that's what you really want, I won't force you." Relief flooded through me. "Thank you." But the look in his eyes told me something else. Henry wasn't going to tell Julian. But he wasn't going to let me go through this alone either. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I was relieved or terrified. Part 5: Love, Loss, and Goodbye. The days passed in a slow, cruel blur. My body was growing weaker, and the hospital had become my prison. Henry was there every day, checking in on me, making sure I ate something, making sure I didn't fade away completely. But no matter how much he tried, he couldn't stop what was coming. I had accepted it. The only thing I had accepted was that I might leave this world without seeing Julian one last time. One evening, as I sat by the window of my hospital room, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, Henry entered with a look that sent a shiver down my spine. "Emma," he said carefully, his voice unreadable. "You have a visitor." My heart stopped. I didn't even need to ask who it was. The door opened, and Julian stepped inside. I barely recognized him. His face was paler, his eyes darker, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name. His suit was wrinkled, his hair slightly messy like he had run his hands through it too many times. He looked lost. "Emma," he breathed, as if saying my name hurt him. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. "How did he find out?" "Henry." I glanced at him, but he only gave me a small, unapologetic nod before walking out of the room, leaving us alone. Julian took slow, hesitant steps toward me. "Why didn't you tell me?" I swallowed hard. "Because it wouldn't have changed anything." His eyes burned. "It changes everything." I shook my head. "Julian, I didn't want you to stay out of guilt. I didn't want you to feel obligated to." "Obligated?" He interrupted, his voice rough, raw. "Emma, do you think I could ever be with you out of obligation? Do you think I would ever love you out of pity?" Tears welled in my eyes, but I blinked them away. "You don't have to do this. I already made peace with it." His jaw clenched. "Well, I haven't." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "You think you're sparing me pain? You think by pushing me away, you're making it easier? You're not, Emma. You're breaking me." I sucked in a shaky breath. "Julian." "No," he cut me off, stepping closer. "You don't get to make this decision for me. You don't get to decide how I love you. You are mine, and I am yours. I don't care if we're divorced. I don't care if you think there's no future. I don't care about anything except you." A sob broke free from my lips. "Julian, I'm dying." "So what?" His voice cracked, and I saw the shine of tears in his eyes. "So what if you're dying? Does that mean I should just pretend I don't love you? That I should just let you go?" "I won't. I can't." I stared at him, my whole body trembling. "I don't want you to watch me fade away." He stepped even closer, until he was right in front of me. His hands cupped my face, his touch warm, grounding. "Then don't fade. Stay. Fight. Let me fight for you." "Julian," I whispered, my heart aching with love, with loss. "I don't know if I can." "Then let me be strong for you." His forehead pressed against mine, his breath uneven. "Let me love you for as long as I can. However long that is. Please, Emma. Let me stay." The dam inside me finally broke. I leaned into him, into the only place that had ever felt like home, and I let myself sob. He held me, whispering words I couldn't quite hear, but I felt them. I felt everything. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone. Julian never left my side after that. Every day, he was there. When I was too weak to walk, he carried me. When I couldn't eat, he fed me. When the pain became too much, he held me through it. He never once looked at me like I was dying. He looked at me like I was still the love of his life. I don't know how much time passed. Days, weeks. But I treasured each moment, clung to them like precious treasures. Because I knew the end was coming. And when it did, I wanted to leave with nothing but love in my heart. One evening, as we lay in bed together, Julian's arms wrapped around me, I whispered, "Julian?" He hummed against my hair. Tell me something happy." He chuckled softly. "Happy?" "Yeah," I murmured. "Something. Gee, that makes you smile." He was quiet for a moment before he said, "You." I smiled weakly. That's not a story. It's the only one that matters. I closed my eyes, savoring the warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. Julian? I love you. His arms tightened around me. I love you too, baby. Always. And that was the last thing I remembered before I fell asleep. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in our bed anymore. I was somewhere warm, somewhere bright. Somewhere peaceful. And in that moment, I realized I was free. I smiled softly, closing my eyes once more. Goodbye, Julian. I love you. Always.